Good morning, guys. All right, so we last left off in Humphrey, where that man, remember the city council man, was giving a long, boring speech to the class. Some of you made predictions that Humphrey might try to get out of the cage, maybe spice things up a little bit. Let's find out. Let's find out. All the parents and students tried hard to concentrate on what Mr. Dalton was saying, but as he went on and on and on, it was harder to pay attention. If only he made the reading of his statistics as interesting as Mrs. Brisbane makes her stories sound. Soon I saw Seth start to fidget. His sister Lucinda gave him a hard jab in the ribs with her elbow, and he settled down again. Mr. and Mrs. Payne looked a little drowsy, and when I glanced at my friend Dot, I saw that her eyes were closed and her chin was dropping. Didn't Mr. Dudley Dalton notice that he was putting his audience to sleep? I guess not, since he never looked up from his paper, not once. Everyone tried hard to pay attention until Mr. Dalton got stuck on the word economics. It's a hard word, I'll admit, but when he said economics, Gail started giggling, and what's worse, Gail's mom started giggling too. Mr. Dalton corrected himself, economics. And that pretty much sums up the growth of this wonderful community we all call home. He folded up his paper and everyone applauded, probably because they were relieved that he had finished. When everyone clapped, Dot's eyes opened wide, her head jerked up, and she said, "Oh," rather loudly. The applause had stopped, so Mrs. Brisbane asked her if she had a question. Dot stood up. Not a question, just a comment. Facts and figures are fine, but what makes up a community is people. And I've known some pretty doggone interesting people in my lifetime here. Mother, Mr. Stevenson whispered, "Sit down." Grandma, Lucinda whispered, "Please." But Mrs. Brisbane smiled. I couldn't agree more. That encouraged Dot to keep going. I was hoping she'd tell the story of the dancing bear. For example, when I was growing up here, ugh, Lucinda groaned loudly and Seth squirmed in his chair, but that didn't stop Dot. I grew up in a yellow house with white trim down on Alder Street. There were nice houses down there, with big trees around and a store on the corner. Even though it wasn't as big as this room, you could find anything you'd want in that store. "Where Pedorama is now," I squeaked. I hadn't planned on saying anything. It just slipped out. Gail and her mom started giggling again. That didn't stop Dot either. "You kids like the mall, but did you know there used to be a roller skating rink there with an amusement park next door? Had a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel. Only cost a quarter." Boy, I have to say, Dot had everyone's attention now. Mr. Dudley Dalton nervously folded and refolded his paper while she talked. When you talk about history, you have to know the facts and figures, sure. You also have to know how people lived, what they did, how they thought, what they did for fun. Dot was running out of steam, or else she was getting tired of Lucinda tugging on her skirt, trying to get her to sit down. Anyway, that's my opinion. She sat down. Lucinda, Mrs. Stevenson, and Seth all acted pretty nervous, but then a nice thing happened. People began to applaud, not for Mr. Dudley Dalton of the City Council, but for Dot. Mrs. Brisbane clapped too. "Class, I think we found our next social studies project. I think we should get out and interview people like Mrs. Larrabee and find out what life used to be like in this town. You can talk to your parents, your grandparents, your neighbors. Mrs. Brisbane works down at the senior center. I think that would also be a good place to meet people. What do you think, Mr. Dalton? A fine idea, he said, running his handkerchief across his forehead. People are finest resources. Mrs. Brisbane did a good job of wrapping things up so that people could go home. Instead of leaving, parents and their children gathered around Dot, asking her questions about the amusement park and Alder Street and things they'd like to get together. Dot's skin was rosy and she was smiling a lot more than when I stayed in the house. I think Grandma's a star, I heard Seth's mother tell her children. Great, Lucinda said, dramatically rolling her eyes. It turns out that Dot wasn't the only one drawing a crowd. The entire Payne family gathered around my cage. For the first time since I'd known them, they were all smiling at once. Here's our guy, said Mrs. Payne. Yes, sir, Humphrey, we owe you our thanks. I'm sorry you had to go to the vet, but if you hadn't, I never would have gotten that job at the clinic. A good job, too. Nice people and nice animals. Yippee! And not only had he gotten the job, but he liked it. I think I'm going to take some classes so I can get promoted, he added. Without you, I wouldn't have been able to go back on the day shift and spend more time with the kids, said Mrs. Payne. And I wouldn't have gotten my very own hamster, said Mandy. You know, Winky. He's the cutest hamster I've ever seen. Next to you, of course. Ooh, some of you predicted that. Winky, the toothless, one-eyed hamster, had a real home. Thanks, Humphrey. You can come to our house any time, said Mrs. Payne. Next time, I get to hold him, said Pammy. No, I get to hold him, said Tammy. Me too, said Brian. Some things don't ever change, I guess. Winky had his paws full living at the Payne's house. Somehow, I knew he could handle it. We're going to stop there for today. Prediction time. Every one of you is going to make a prediction and tell me about it on the next page. What do you think's going to happen? Do you think Humphrey is going to be okay back in school? Do you think anyone's going to notice that he can, in fact, still open his new cage? Tell me what you think. We'll have to find out Monday.